Okay, so here we go again. Uh, you know, there's a lot of talk about old bikes these days. The thing about old bikes is, A, they're cheaper, and that's a factor for some people. The other thing is that there were a lot more choices. So none of these are technically available now, but the Stratus bikes down on Dan hung on the longest. But so this up front here, this is a Gliss, and I hang on to that because there's some roads where I feel the need for suspension. It's a pokey bike, but how many other suspension long wheelbase bikes are there? Anyway, I'm getting off schedule here. I was going to start with seat struts. So there might be, I thought there was 3, but I think there might be 4 different generations. So the first ones were silver, and I thought they were skinnier than the current ones, but I do think there was a skinnier version early on, and then a fatter silver version, and then a couple versions of the black ones. And what I want to point out about these is that there was a generation that was open on the bottom and had that little curved washer thing, and you know, if you didn't mess with them, I think they were probably okay, but if you took your seat off and on much, this could get bent and fail. And it's a pain in the butt to keep this aligned when you're tightening it up. The other funny thing is, so that's the open end. This is the closed end, and these bottom parts came in 2 different lengths. And I've probably got the short one on the tall bike and the long one on the short bike. But so you think they seem, there's been some dimensional drift over the years, so it seems like this diameter and this diameter are the same on this strut as on that strut, but this flute tube will not go into the closed to the bottom to this section of the closed end strut. It seems like it fits, but then you stick it in and it jams. So that could just be paint, but there's a lot of quirky little things like that. And interestingly, that strut there looks a lot like that strut there, so they kind of went back to where they started, because like I say, these have a tendency to fail. So then the odd man out here is this baby, and this has caused some consternation for myself and for RANS. These had a couple of different failure points. So initially it would fail here. They came with a welded on bolt, and this is aluminum, I think, and so that would crack. And so what you do is if you don't have the seat too far forward, and there's plenty of length, so you would cut off the bolt, push the slot down further, you know, put a circle on the end of it, and then use some other kind of clamp, seat post clamp or something. So, you know, I got one of these from RANS, and it was a big issue for them to make it. And now they won't do this anymore. And the funny thing is that every dimension was off by just a little bit. I can't remember. So this bolt wouldn't go through the frame. I had a machinist I used to work with, so he would fix things like this. So this width was too narrow. The bolt was too big, and so he made it so we could get the bolt through, and then he trimmed the little bit on the frame. So that's done. And but this is the old top, and again, I thought it was all the same dimension, and it seems like it, but this wouldn't go into this until we took the paint off. So pads. So originally pads were like this, and these are good. I like these pads. Bob Bryant didn't like them, but I like them. So, but if you come across one of these, you know, rub it, because as they age, they start to turn to powder. So if I mean, that one's pretty good, but if you might need to replace that, and all these things are expensive. So then they went to these gray pads with holes, and these were not all the same. There was like a bad batch of these. So this one's way too soft and breaks and stuff. So these are things to look for if you're examining a bike. Covers. They're all of these bikes have a good thick cover. There was a period when they did a sort of a thin slippery cover, and those wore out quickly and were so original one was angle brackets, and you know, these will fit on the bottom like that and clamp onto a channel. The mounts on this seat are the current mounts for the V-block. The trick with this is the forces, and I'm not an engineer here, but the forces were applied down here, and they were primarily resisted up here. This was where the channel was stiffest, right? So if you over tighten these, you could pinch the tube. You can distort the top tube on a bike. So you don't want that. So on some bikes, and you can see this in some of my photos, they these things are famous for slipping, and I tried putting something behind it, and some people use a hose clamp. In the end, I tied it on the front. I put a zip tie through it and looped it over the mount, and that kept it from slipping. So after the angle brackets, we get to the radlock. The first ones were sort of, I don't know, carved out of the solid material. This one's broken, by the way. There was supposed to be a hook coming down here. I don't remember breaking that. Somebody might have given me that. I've never broken one. So screw those little screws in, and that adjusts the tension, but don't get carried away or you'll end up like that. There were, I think there were probably 3 generations of these hinges. The hinges screw into this, and the first generation you won't see. I might have a picture of one, but I don't think I've seen one in person. So they were formed metal and they all broke. Then we have this piece, which has more of a machine look to it. And the good thing about this one is it has this little pin here to keep the rod from moving. So this is the final version, and it's pretty good too, but that rod can slide out or start to come out. So you know, you inspect it, you'll catch it. It doesn't come out quickly. So the other thing that happens here is a dimensional change between you know, the spacing on these attachment points, right? So they're not necessarily interchangeable bike to bike. And then the last one is the V-block, and I'm told that those are, the mount spacing is the same regardless of the size of that top tube. So I don't know if you can see this on this mount. The that's like an injection molded piece or something, because it's got, you know, it's not a solid block. It's got little it's relieved. So that was probably the last of the rad locks. So I didn't remember this. That's a V-block. That looks like a Bacchetta mount. So that seat is bolted on. On a RANS mount, like I showed you earlier, there's the mount sits on those screws, and then you put pins underneath it. So I'm not sure how many generations of seat mesh there was. We'll leave off the bucket seat and the current sling mesh. Yeah, but this design right here was used for many years, and then that's actually a Bacchetta mesh, which goes okay on gliss because it's got the single post. It doesn't go on, the holes don't mount up with the RANS for some reason. So then I think after that one came this design, which has buckles on the back. This is the current design, and I think some people complain about them slipping or the buckles are rusting, whatever. This goes on a bike that I don't use all that much right now. We got the seat out. This is a two-piece seat frame that was used on older bikes. So this bit is steel. I believe this bit is aluminum. I can't remember if the cross member is welded or riveted. It might be riveted. So right here there's a joint, and there's a rivet there. And these two, over time, this joint can get loose, and these two can move in relation to each other. Not a big deal. On the ones I was using, I think that Steve Delaire put some epoxy in there or something to make it more solid. And then the later seats are all, this is just the seat frame is one piece with the welded cross member. So let's talk about seats some more. So, man, this may show up better in my photos. When RANS went to the one-piece seat frame, it seemed to, well, you know, it seemed like maybe the seat didn't go back as far relative to the mesh. And there's been a lot of discussion about that on Bent Rider, and you can probably search that up. This cutout is also thought to be a contributing factor. I don't have a particular problem with that, but what I would like to show, I've never seen anybody really say much about this, and I brought it up before. So over the years, there's been some variation in the angle between the back and the base. So I think you can see that this horn is pointed up more than this one, and the back is pretty close, but trust me, there's a difference. And then the third bike is also like this bike in terms of it being more open. So this just, I don't understand why this isn't more of an issue. So again, you know, some people are not sensitive to seats, and I'm extremely sensitive to seats. So I fuss about seats a lot. So on a bike with bracket a little, you know, higher relative to the seat, I lay the seat back a little more, and the flatter, the more open angle works better. On a bike with a lower bottom bracket, I tend to have the seat a little more upright, and so I want the angle more closed, so it holds me in the seat better. So to me, it's a huge difference. Now, another funny thing, this bike here, you say, well, John, why do you have two identical bikes? Well, that bike has 175mm cranks, and I think this Gliss has probably hit, or this tail one probably has 155s, and I used to think it was a big deal, and now I seem to be able to go between them without much issue. So because the cranks, basically I ride on that bike with the seat more laid back than on this bike, because the cranks are at the top of that stroke. The crank, my hip angle is more closed just because the cranks are longer, so that enables me, or makes me more comfortable with having the seat more laid back. So that's an open angle seat, that's a more closed angle seat, and that's an open angle seat. The other thing, sometimes I have kind of big thighs, and the horn, it can chafe a bit. It feels a little big to me. So over the years, I have, from time to time, used short seats, pads. So at one time, RANS made a short stop seat, and it was intended for the Screamer Stoker, because the Screamer, and I have a frame here, the Screamer is this Stoker seat, has the most closed angle of all the seats. So if you want to ride really upright, that might be something to look into. So they made a short stop pan for the Screamer, if somebody wanted that, because you had to put your legs down, and you didn't want too much thigh interference. So I have a short stop seat on one bike or another. I believe this is just a cut down plastic pan. So that's another thing. I'm fairly thick, so for me to be sensitive about the horn, it seems like thin people would be even more sensitive about this depth, and it might, shorter pan might work better for them. But this could just all be my own idiosyncrasies, and maybe it doesn't matter to another soul on the planet. But I haven't tried a B3 seat, a Baketta B3 seat, but the seat is really long here and narrow here, and I can't predict how that would work for me. But I tend to go shorter, A couple other things. I correct something I said in the first part. I was waving around a bunch of programs, and I said races in the 70s, and all the programs said 80s. So there's that. In addition to the strut issue, by the way, I don't mean to sound ungrateful to RANS for making that. I really appreciate it, and I know it's a pain in the ass for them, and we all have to do what we have to do. So they won't be doing any of that stuff anymore. So the Gliss had a Cane Creek shock, and the length was not a length you can get anymore. So Kevin Ostrom modified the swing arm. It looks stock, but it's not, and it accommodates a longer shock. So that solved that problem. Kevin used to do projects for me when he closed his shop. The ill-fated Burley project was a victim of that. Burley, from time to time, I've bought and sold short wheelbase bikes, and they're all too tall for me. The Burley seems like it's not, but I hate the seat, so I was going to put a different seat on there, and that was not a big issue for Kevin, but he's gone. So I haven't been able to find anybody else to do that for me. So the other thing about the Gliss is, I was going to catch him on another thing, seats. So in addition to there being a smaller diameter strut than I showed, I believe, those two-piece seats originally came in two different heights. So there's a short back and a tall back, and then they kind of standardized the height. Other thing about a Gliss is once in a while you see an early one, where's my hand, that doesn't have this gusset. So I think these used to break. This vintage also had a recall on the fork, because I can illustrate that. Turns out I can also, while I was looking for the fork, I found this smaller seat strut. So the flute tubes have remained roughly the same dimension. In the early ones, the bottom part went inside the upper part, and on later ones, the bottom part goes outside the upper part. But the upper part is, you know, roughly the same. I wouldn't say they're interchangeable, but they're roughly the same. And like I say, I think Bacchetta may still use a smaller, but I don't have a Bacchetta in house here. So what's happening with this recall is, and you should, if you're looking at an old bike, you should look that up. It should Google up pretty easily. So these are 1-inch steerers, so we're talking older bike. So what happened was that this bit, so the threads went down too far for this length thing, right? So this expanding bolt was doing its job in the slotted and threaded section, so it could split this steer tube. So you know this was one of the perils. I think this bike was inspected by a dealer before I bought it. I told him about this, and he didn't attend to it. So that's part of the risk of buying at a distance. So let's talk about tailwinds. So the tailwind has two 20-inch wheels. There was a Blue Wave that had a 20-inch rear and a 16-inch front, and it had a solid axle with nuts on it in back and lower grade components than the tailwind. And then there was a Wave that had two 20-inch wheels and was basically the same as the tailwind, but it had lower components. So these were made for many years with an 1.5-inch main tube, and those were my favorites. When this bike, the 2-inch tube caused a lot of problems on more than one RANS bike. I guess this is as good a place as any to digress to the Vivo. I don't have a Vivo. There was a yellow Vivo with a 2-inch main tube. The original Vivo had the same, was just sort of the analog of the Gliss, and it had an 1.5-inch main tube. 2-inch main tube yellow Vivo. That seat had an unusually open angle, so if you got that seat in a reasonable upright position, it had the angle clamps. The quick release on the bottom of that seat mount would dig into the top tube, and if the seat was too far forward, the chain would hit the seat mount because the tube had pushed out that dimension. So I've seen that tube push out the dimension on aluminum V3s. I've seen a dealer try to put a clamp on derailleur on an aluminum V3. It didn't work. It should work, but it didn't. And so I'm a favor of the 1.5-inch main tube. The other thing that happened with a 2-inch tube on this bike was it got too stiff. By my gauge for too stiff, as I mentioned earlier, is if my neck hurts after a ride, it's too stiff. And this one, I thought it was okay, but then a couple hours later, I felt like I wasn't on a smart ride. So, I seem to recall a discussion with Randy where he kind of thought these bottom tubes were just under tension, so they didn't matter much. Well, I disagree. I think if you're just sitting on the bike, right, it's a static load. But when you're pedaling, there's all kinds of forces on a bike. There's twisting. The forces are asymmetric because the chain only runs down one side of the bike. It doesn't run down the center line of the bike. So this is trying to pull itself together, wants to bend the frame, and then your levers are constantly moving up here, so it wants to twist the frame. So big diameter is good for twisting, but I think I would have been curious to see what would happen if they had just made these tubes bigger and left that 1.5 inches. The other thing, of course, is a longer wheelbase. I like the compactness of these bikes. It's part of the reason why I still have several of them, and I have one of the small tube ones with couplers in it, and I was using that quite a bit when I traveled. You know, like I was going to Florida for the season, and I'd have that bike down there all season and ride the wheels off the damn thing. So this layout is kind of an obsession with me. RANS did a prototype of one of these with a 26-inch rear wheel, and I have a photo of that. And I don't now when I try to suss it out here, it looks to me like if I raise the chain line that much, it would hit the mount. Can't be sure about that, but that's with a 26. So RANS did that. There was a prototype of the Agio in steel that was a sweet-looking bike too. So the Agio is sort of the one that got away from me, and the Bella for that matter. I think they're both great designs. Too stiff for me, both the Agio and the Bella. You know, they were committed to the seat mount and the tube diameter, and the Bellandari had wood pogo, so you know, porridge was too cold and then the porridge was too hot. So, but those were fine efforts in my opinion, and ones that got away. So I keep wiggling his tooth, and I don't know where it's going to end up. I think about trying to find somebody who could, you know, stretch. Basically, put a rear triangle back here. You know, keep this part all the same, seat height all the same, and just push this back, and as big a wheel as it can take without the chain coming up too close to the seat mount. It has occurred to me that I'm reinventing the V2. Although the V2, I would like to avoid the drive side idler, and the V2 is heavily reliant on that. I do own a V2 formula. It's not on the premises right now. I mean, in fairness, apparently these bikes, strong people could crack the frame up here. So they went to the big tube, and then they ran these tubes underneath to reinforce this whole bottom bracket area. So I think they could have gotten by with these. I don't know. Shoulda, woulda. So probably even more. I haven't said a word about any of the boards. Probably even more controversial than my tailwind affection would be my tolerance for T-bars. I got them on the Gliss, I got them on this bike, I got them on other tailwinds. I just don't have a problem with them. But these are an abomination by many people's standards. So you find your own path there with everything, of course. And my whole point here is that you know, a recumbent can change a person's life, and if a used bike will enable that change for someone who can't afford a new one, I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think many of you know what a life-changing thing it can be, so I'll leave it at that.